Well, good morning, everybody. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm not going to talk about what I said I'm going to talk about in the papers in front of you. I was going to talk to you about the Obama pivot to Asia. The reason I'm not going to do that is because I think it's been covered pretty elegantly by previous speakers. I will touch on it, but I won't go into it in a lot of detail. I want to actually do something different and address the key themes of this symposium workshop today, which is who are going to be the rule setters for Asia in the 21st century and what will those rules be? So I just want to give you a little bit of historical context and make some observations that I hope we can discuss later on in the session. I'm a great believer in before you can know where you're going, you need to know where you've come from. So before I'm going to talk about the new rules for Asia and who's going to set them, let's first of all just reflect back on what the old rules were and who set them. And there are two things you need to know about this. One is there was a macro system that was set up in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. And of course Asia has to fit into that, so we need to understand some elements about the macro system as it was. Now the key point really to take on board in terms of our discussion this morning is that the architecture and the rules were set by the victors of the Second World War, unsurprisingly. And that was essentially the West and primarily the United States. So the US was the key player in setting up the preeminent institutions economically, financially and strategically after World War II. And you all know what they are: the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council dominated by victors of the Second World War. Now that was the basic architecture globally. And within Asia, of course, Asia reflected that, but it had its own features. There were more players, of course, but basically the rules of the game were determined primarily by the United States in terms of its alliance system in Asia. This is from a security perspective. But of course, it wasn't unchallenged during the Cold War period, as we all know, because the Soviet Union and its supporters were contesting the US view of how the world would be run and who would set the rules. So that was essentially the Cold War structure that dominated in Asia for the best part of 50, 60 years. Now, all that came to a sudden halt in 1989 as the Soviet Union collapsed. And for a brief unipolar moment, which lasted for about 15 years, the US dominated the region. It was the preeminent rule setter. And all it did was essentially entrench its interests and its domination of the existing architecture as it had done for the previous 50 or 60 years. Now that started to erode, and I always take my starting point for this at about 2003, when the US seemed to be at the very pinnacle of its power. 2003, remember what happened in 2003, of course, there was the intervention in Iraq. The US seemed to be able to do what it wanted. And of course, George W. Bush declared prematurely, as it turned out, victory in Iraq. Now, if you look what's happened in the years since then, which is not that long ago, the picture is of relative US decline, and some of my colleagues have already touched on that. So the US is no longer the preeminent or dominant rule setter, although it's still extremely influential and will continue to be so in my view. But other countries are rising, and I just want to talk about that for a bit. So let me just go back a little bit to 1967, which I think is a very important year in Asia. ASEAN was established. So even though we had an international system, an old world order, if you like, dominated by the United States and the West, Asia was starting to think about the region and starting to demand a say. From very humble beginnings, of course, because ASEAN was really only a sub-regional organisation, essentially a Southeast Asian one, only a small handful of states. But gradually we saw over the next 2 or 3 decades a flowering of Asian institutions. And interestingly, they were in the driver's seat, were the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, the small and medium-sized countries, for a period of time drove this process of regional institutionalism in the security and economic domains. So, you know, most of you are familiar with this alphabet of institutions that have sprung up, but just to touch on a few, apart from ASEAN, of course, we had the ASEAN Regional Forum, and then ASEAN expanded, so it became ++. We had all sorts of acronyms added onto that. The East Asia Summit, we had APEC, of course, which was a Trans-Pacific organisation, but again, Asian states were key players in that. That was quite a transformation, but it was basically cobbled onto the existing or the legacy arrangements. So you still had the US security alliance in place. That was starting to evolve and change too. So you had more players in the game with more divergent interests. So even by the end of the Cold War, it was clear that the way in which Asia used to be run and the rule setters were already starting to change, even though the US still appeared to be the dominant country. Now, my argument is that that process has accelerated, obviously driven a lot by China's rise, but also by India, and what Fareed Zakaria calls the rise of the rest. The rest being countries like Australia and other middle powers in the region. So none of the middle and smaller powers want to see a system or return to the old system, which was dominated by one or two major powers or traditional balance of power politics. So if you look at where we are today, you will see that the existing institutions are evolving quite rapidly, and that power is becoming more diffuse, and the US can no longer get its way in Asia, even though it is attempting to pivot back. Let me just say a few words about the pivot, since I did promise to say something about it. We've heard about the TPP, and I agree entirely with my colleagues that when you think about the pivot, or a lot of people in the US now like to call it a rebalance, but I'll use the term pivot, okay? It's not just a military pivot or a political one or economic, it's all three. So the aim here from the United States point of view is to consolidate its position in Asia and start to begin to write the new rules of the 21st century, economically, politically and strategically. Now, it's a very ambitious undertaking. I think there are a lot of question marks about whether that's going to be achieved. Just to give you one quick example on the military side, if you look closely at what the pivot means, it doesn't mean a great deal in military terms. Essentially, all it means is the redeployment of about 10,000 Marines out of Okinawa to Hawaii, Guam and Australia. It's not a lot. And a couple of littoral combat ships being stationed in Singapore. That's essentially the extent of it at the moment. It's not a lot. However, the important point is it's indicative of where the US wants to go. But the big question marks are, can it afford it? Now, Don and others touched on this morning. We could have a very interesting discussion about US military capabilities given their fiscal realities. I've got major concerns about the US is going to be able to afford anything, let alone pivoting, okay? But anyway, still, you've got to look long term. It may not be able to afford it in the next couple of years, but 10 and 20 years down the track, if the US regains its economic strength, what will follow is a serious rebuilding of their military capability in Asia. I've got no doubt about that. The question mark is, can they afford to do it, certainly in the short term. Okay, so let's just talk about what the old rules of the game were. Well, I'll do this in shorthand. If you go back to 1945, of course the US, the big labels used were democracy, freedom, markets, and of course all underpinned by US military power, okay? Now, some of those aspirational goals have been internationalised in the sense they're not Western anymore. Not too many countries argue against democracy. Right? We all have different conceptions of what democracy means, and it plays out in different ways. But most people these days think democracy is a good thing, or certainly they like the sound of the term. So some of these rules, if you like, have been internationalised, and I don't think, therefore, they're going to change much in the short to medium term. So my basic proposition is that when you have a legacy system, when you're talking about the international order and the Asian order, things are only going to change slowly because it's a massive ship. If we want to come back to our ship metaphor, to turn it around takes a long time. Okay, and you've got a lot of vested interests in the status quo who are going to resist the transfer of power. Is the US going to give up voluntarily power to China, as Hugh White would argue? I don't think so. Why would the US voluntarily give up power to China or to a competitor? Are the Europeans going to cede power to Asia on the IMF, the World Bank and so on? According to Barry Desker, they should, but are the Europeans going to do it? Not unless they have to. Okay, so vested interest comes in here. So there will be changes, but they'll be a lot slower than most people think. And it's not entirely clear to me whether the new system, the new Asian order, is going to be hugely different from the one we see today. So let's think about the one we see today. It is characterised by obviously multipolarity. So there are more than just China and the United States involved here. There are the major Asian powers, but there's also a host of medium-sized, very significant countries who want to play. Don't forget also, we've got non-state actors, NGOs, civil societies. We've got other players on the board that are not states, and they will be equally influential in shaping the new order. So a couple of things, takeaways from my point of view about all this is, one, it will be much more difficult to get consensus in the region on issues of common security issues because there are more players with divergent interests. Two, there are a lot of what I would call wannabe regional powers or hegemons. I mean, in the Middle East we can talk about Iran, but in Asia we can talk about countries like South Korea, maybe in Vietnam. What about Australia? We have our own aspirations. We don't actually walk in lockstep with the Americans, as some people imagine. We do have our own views. So you're going to have the rest, as Zachary would say, playing more influential roles. It's going to be more difficult to get consensus and agreement around issues. And that's probably not good news for the system, but that's democracy at work internationally, if you like. Europe will be far less influential in this part of the world than it has been for 500 years. Now, Coral Bell has written elegantly about the end of the Vasco da Gama era, and that is true. When I look at future European influence in this part of the world, I don't see a lot of scope for Europe to play a role, unless and until it can get its economic house in order. Europe's share of world GDP now has shrunk from about a high point of 33% in the 1800s to about 15% today. So it's still significant, but most of its energies and activities will be devoted to European affairs of getting their house in order. It doesn't have the time and energy or the resources to play in Asia in a serious way. Okay, final couple of points, and I'll finish on this note. Let's look about some of the ideas for new regional order in Asia. We've got a G20. Could we have a G2? That is a kind of condominium in which US and China divide up the region into spheres of influence and run the show. Okay, option one. Option two, could we have some kind of Asian concert of power? Now, those of you who've studied your European history will know that at the Congress of Vienna, the victorious powers in Europe basically ran Europe for the next 50 years without too much conflict because the interests coincided, essentially. Is that the case in Asia? And who would actually be members of the concert of power? Now, again, if I can come back to my colleague Hugh White, who's argued very persuasively that, well, why can't the great powers in Asia run Asia peacefully as the Europeans did 200 years ago? Who would they be? They would be China, the United States, Japan, India, maybe Indonesia. Now, is that going to be acceptable to all the other countries who are not part of that group? I don't think so. So I don't believe that a G2 or an Asian concert of powers is feasible or workable, nor is there any inclination of any of those states to be part of it. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the system we have today, which is changing incrementally, and the strategic shift is towards empowering Asian countries to deal with the issues of this region. They will change the rules over time, but it's not entirely clear to me how they're going to change them and to what end. Are we going to become less liberal or more liberal? Because there are countervailing trends going on here. Are we going to eschew the alliance structures of the last 100 years and get rid of all of those together? Not necessarily so, but we may have other kinds of groupings around individual issues. So you'll have coalitions of the willing, not only in security affairs, but also in trade and economic affairs too, grouped around issues that certain countries can agree to. And they'll try and set the rules for that particular issue. But in terms of the whole structure of the region, it's going to be very difficult to get agreement about what the rules will be. So I think I've probably just about exceeded my time, so I'll leave it there, and I'll be very happy to talk about any of this later. Thank you very much.